If history dazzles with kings in velvet, then lurking behind Henry VIII's broad shoulders was a man in black with the rough face of a boxer. This was Thomas Cromwell, a glitch in the system, a man with cold eyes always calculating the value of everything. From the mud of the lowest class, this son of a drunken blacksmith tore up the rules to become the kingdom's most terrifying mastermind. Cromwell coldly dismantled the 1,000-year-old church brick by brick, becoming the ruthless fixer who made the king's ambitions reality. He wielded his pen like a dagger, serving as both the genius architect and the brute force of the Reformation. But before the power and the politics, let's look at the violent past that actually built Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell was born around 1485, a date significant not just for his arrival, but for the nation. It was the year the Tudor dynasty was born in blood at Bosworth Field, ending the Wars of the Roses. But while the nobility was settling its scores on the battlefield, a different kind of war was being fought in the Cromwell household in Putney. Putney today is a genteel suburb of London, a place of rowing clubs and expensive villas. In the late 15th century, it was a rough industrial settlement on the south bank of the Thames, smelling of charcoal, stale beer, and sheep. It was a place of hard labor, where men worked themselves to death before they were 40, and the hardest, meanest man in Putney was Walter Cromwell. Walter was a man of many trades, none of them honest. He was a blacksmith, hammering iron into horseshoes and tools. He was a brewer, running an alehouse where the beer was often sour. He was a fuller, processing raw wool with urine and clay. But primarily, Walter Cromwell was a bully. The local court rolls, the manorial records that survive to this day, are a testament to his chaos. Walter was fined no fewer than 48 times for watering down his beer. He was hauled before the magistrates for assaulting his neighbors, for allowing his cattle to graze on common land, for endless petty feuds. Imagine young Thomas growing up in this atmosphere. He was the youngest, a boy with a quick mind and a watchful eye, living in a house that perpetually smelled of hot iron, sulfur, and the sour reek of fermentation. But the most dangerous element in the house was his father's temper. We do not have diaries from Cromwell's childhood, but we have the evidence of the man he became. You do not develop Cromwell's specific brand of hypervigilance, the ability to read a room instantly, to anticipate a blow before it lands, to placate a tyrant without practice. Thomas learned these skills at the dinner table. He learned that authority, his father, was capricious, violent, and often drunk. He learned that justice was something you had to buy or fight for. He learned that if you showed weakness, you were crushed. By the time Thomas was a teenager, he was already hardening. He was becoming a ruffian, a mirror image of his father. He was getting into fights, running with local gangs, drifting toward a life of petty crime that would likely have ended at the end of a rope. England was too small for his ambition, and his home was too dangerous for his survival. So, around the year 1503, Thomas Cromwell did the most extraordinary thing of his young life. He didn't just run away, he vanished. He walked out of the forge, turned his back on the Thames, and crossed the English Channel. He was a boy with no money, no connections, no formal education, and no patron. In a time when few people traveled more than 10 miles from their birthplace, Thomas Cromwell walked into the vast, chaotic maw of continental Europe. This period is known to historians as the Lost Decade. It is the black box of Cromwell's life. When he left England, he was a thug. When he returned 10 years later, he was a polymath. What happened in between is the key to understanding the terrifying efficiency of his later years. While the young King Henry VIII was sitting in his palaces, learning to play the lute, write poetry, and joust in padded armor. Thomas Cromwell was learning how the real world worked. And the real world, in the early 16th century, was a slaughterhouse. He headed south, drawn like a moth to the flames of Italy. Italy was the center of the world, the richest, most cultured, and most violent place in Europe. It was a patchwork of warring city-states invaded constantly by the superpowers of France and Spain. Cromwell, needing to eat, did what many rootless young men did. He sold his blood. He joined the French army as a mercenary. We must pause to appreciate the sheer brutality of this existence. This was not the romanticized warfare of knights and chivalry. This was the dawn of modern infantry warfare. Cromwell would have carried a pike, a wooden spear 18 feet long, and marched in a square of thousands of men. The strategy was simple. You created a wall of spear points and walked into the enemy. If the man in front of you fell, you stepped over his body and took his place. In December 1503, Cromwell found himself at the Battle of Garigliano. The French army was facing the Spanish forces for control of the Kingdom of Naples. It was a disaster. The French were trapped in freezing mud, decimated by artillery and Spanish tactics. The retreat was a horror show of starvation, drowning, and slaughter. Young Thomas Cromwell saw men, friends perhaps, gutted like fish in the freezing mud of the Garigliano River. He saw officers abandon their men to save their own skins. He learned the most valuable lesson of his life. Honor gets you killed. Strategy gets you home. He learned that the world does not care about your lineage or your prayers. It cares about leverage, logistics, and power. He survived the retreat, likely by deserting or using his wits to blend into the countryside. He was done with soldiering. He had seen the sharp end of power, and he decided he would rather be the hand that wields the weapon than the weapon itself. Ragged, traumatized, but alive, Cromwell made his way to Florence. If Putney was the forge, Florence was the university. In the early 1500s, Florence was the intellectual and financial capital of the Renaissance. It was the city of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Medicis. It was a city where art was a weapon of state and banking was a religion. How a rough English mercenary talked his way into the service of the Frescobaldi, one of the most powerful banking families in Europe, is a mystery. But it speaks to Cromwell's immense personal charisma and his adaptability. Perhaps they needed a bodyguard who spoke English. Perhaps they saw the spark of intelligence in his eyes. Whatever the reason, they took him in. And Thomas Cromwell, the sponge, began to absorb the Renaissance. In the counting houses of the Frescobaldi, he learned the new science of double-entry bookkeeping. He learned how to track money across borders. He learned that gold was fluid, that it could buy armies, bribe popes, and topple kings. He learned the merchant's hand, the clear, efficient script of business, so different from the Gothic scrawl of English monks. But he learned more than finance. He learned the language of power. He became fluent in Italian, French, and Latin. He read the works of the ancients, and he walked the same streets as a disgraced diplomat named Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was writing The Prince around the time Cromwell was in Italy. We do not know if they met, but Cromwell certainly inhaled the same air. He absorbed the Machiavellian doctrine that a ruler must do what is necessary, not what is moral, that it is better to be feared than loved, that the ends justify the means. While the English nobles back home were obsessing over the codes of chivalry, a dead code for a dead age, Cromwell was learning the code of the future. He was learning realpolitik. He saw that the Pope was not just a spiritual leader, but a worldly prince with armies and spies. He saw that treaties were made to be broken. He saw that the state was a machine, and like any machine, it could be taken apart and reassembled. From Florence, he moved north to Antwerp, the great trading hub of the Netherlands. He became a merchant of cloth, dealing in the English wool trade. He learned the intricacies of international commerce, the laws of the sea, the art of the contract. By the time he returned to England around 1514, Thomas Cromwell was effectively a new species of man. He was 30 years old. He was cosmopolitan, cynical, sophisticated, and utterly self-made. He carried the Renaissance in his pocket, concealed behind a mask of dull competence, ready to unleash it on a sleepy medieval England. When Cromwell stepped back onto English soil, he found a country that felt small. England was a second-rate power on the fringe of Europe, obsessed with past glories. But Cromwell was a man in a hurry. He settled in London and set about building a life. He married Elizabeth Wykes, a wealthy widow from a respectable family. It was a good match, one that brought him money and status. For a brief, shining moment, Cromwell had what his father never did, a peaceful home. He was a loving father to his children, Gregory, Anne, and Grace. He filled his house with beautiful things, Italian velvet, Venetian glass, the smell of saffron, and expensive wax. He was civilized. But a man of his talents could not remain a simple cloth merchant for long. His reputation as a man who could get things done began to spread through the legal circles of London, and eventually his name reached the ear of the only man in England whose ambition matched his own, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was the Lord Chancellor, the Archbishop of York, the Cardinal Legate. He was the Alter Rex, the other king. Like Cromwell, Wolsey was lowborn, the son of a butcher from Ipswich. He had risen through the church to become the absolute ruler of England's administration. King Henry, young and bored with governance, was happy to let Wolsey run the country while he hunted and danced. Wolsey needed men, not noblemen who looked down on him, but capable men who owed him everything. In Thomas Cromwell, Wolsey saw a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler from the lower depths who had clawed his way up. Wolsey brought Cromwell into his household, and the education of the future minister began in earnest. If Italy had been his undergraduate degree, working for Wolsey was his doctorate. Wolsey entrusted Cromwell with his most sensitive legal affairs. Specifically, he tasked Cromwell with a project that would serve as the blueprint for the future Reformation. Wolsey wanted to build a grand new college at Oxford, Cardinal College, now Christ Church, and a grammar school in Ipswich. To fund these monuments to his own ego, Wolsey decided to dissolve 30 small, decaying monasteries and seize their assets. It was Cromwell who did the legwork. He rode out to these small priories. He audited their books. He evicted the handful of monks living there. He sold the lead from the roofs and the timber from the barns. He navigated the complex legal thicket of property rights and papal bulls. This was the dress rehearsal. Cromwell was learning the mechanics of destruction. He was learning that the church was not a holy mystery, but a corporation, and a poorly managed one at that. He saw the rot in the foundations. He saw that the people did not rise up to defend these monasteries. They mostly shrugged. He filed this information away. But the wheel of fortune, as the medieval poets constantly warned, never stops turning. By 1529, Cardinal Wolsey was in trouble. He had failed in the one task that mattered, securing King Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Henry, obsessed with Anne Boleyn and desperate for a male heir, had lost patience. The great matter of the divorce had dragged on for years. When a tyrant loses patience, heads roll. The fall of Wolsey was swift and brutal. The nobility who had hated the butcher's son for decades descended like wolves. They stripped him of his titles. They seized his great palace at York Place, which became Whitehall. They accused him of premunire, asserting papal authority over the king. Wolsey's household panic-stricken. His servants and hangers-on fled in droves, terrified of being caught in the blast radius of the king's anger. To be associated with Wolsey was social and political suicide, except for one man. Thomas Cromwell did not run. In the autumn of 1529, as the shadows lengthened over Wolsey's life, Cromwell sat in the window of the great hall at Esher, weeping over a primer. But he wasn't weeping for long. He dried his eyes and formulated a plan. He rode to London. He got himself elected to Parliament. And there, in the House of Commons, Thomas Cromwell delivered a performance that became legendary. He stood up, a lone voice in a hostile room, and delivered a passionate, legally brilliant defense of his fallen master. He dismantled the charges of treason. He argued with such eloquence and wit that even Wolsey's enemies were silenced. He could not save Wolsey's career. The king's will was absolute, but he saved Wolsey from immediate execution, and he secured a pardon, however temporary. Why did he do it? Was it sentimentality, loyalty? Perhaps. But it was also a masterstroke of calculation. King Henry was watching. From the shadows, the king observed this man, Cromwell. He saw a man who was loyal when it was dangerous to be loyal. He saw a man who did not panic when the ship was sinking. He saw a lawyer who could argue black into white. Henry was surrounded by sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. In Cromwell, he saw something different, a man of iron. Wolsey died in November 1530 on his way to the Tower, broken and terrified. The king summoned the cardinal's lawyer to court. Thomas Cromwell walked into the royal presence, knelt, and looked up into the small, terrifying eyes of Henry VIII. The butcher's boy was dead. The blacksmith's boy had arrived. With the death of the cardinal, the apprenticeship was over, but the true danger had only just begun. Cromwell was no longer shielded by Wolsey's scarlet robes. He was now standing exposed in the harsh light of the royal court. He had stepped out of the servants' hall and onto the highest stage in Europe, a stage slick with the blood of those who had failed before him. As the year 1530 turned, the new minister looked at the tangled mess of the king's great matter, the divorce that had destroyed his mentor, and realized that to survive, he would have to do more than just argue the law. He would have to rewrite it. When Thomas Cromwell entered the service of Henry VIII in 1530, the English court was a place of suffocating tension. It was a gilded cage where the air was thick with conspiracy and fear. The king was approaching 40. He was no longer the golden prince of the Renaissance, the slender athlete who had charmed Europe. The waistline was thickening, the temper was shortening, and the face was growing heavy with frustration. Henry was a man used to getting what he wanted, instantly. But for 3 agonizing years, he had been denied the one thing he craved above all else, a legitimate son. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, was past childbearing age. His mistress, Anne Boleyn, refused to sleep with him until she was queen. And the Pope, Clement VII, refused to grant the annulment that would allow Henry to swap the former for the latter. The king's government was paralyzed. The great nobles, the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, were warriors, not theologians. They blustered and threatened, but they had no solution. They were banging their heads against the brick wall of canon law. Into this deadlock stepped the blacksmith's son. Cromwell did not look like a savior. He looked like a thug in a doublet. He walked with a distinctive rolling gait, his hands often clasped behind his back, his eyes missing nothing. He was an outsider, a new man, who had no noble blood to protect and no family honor to uphold. He had only his brain and his terrifying capacity for work. While the courtiers hunted and gossiped, Cromwell read. He read the ancient histories. He read the controversial Lutheran texts smuggled in from Germany. He read the obscure legal precedents of the English crown, and he realized that everyone else was looking at the problem the wrong way. The king's advisors were asking, how do we convince the Pope to say yes? Cromwell asked a different question. Why do we need the Pope at all? There is a moment, likely in late 1531 or early 1532, that marks the true beginning of modern England. It likely happened in the king's privy garden or a quiet gallery at Greenwich Palace. Cromwell approached the king. He knew he was walking a tightrope. To suggest breaking with Rome was heresy. It was spiritual suicide. It was a thought so radical that it could have sent him straight to the stake. But Cromwell knew his audience. He knew Henry was vain. He knew Henry believed he was chosen by God. So Cromwell didn't frame it as a religious revolution. He framed it as a matter of jurisdiction and profit. He told Henry that he was being played. He told him that the bishops of England were only half subjects. They swore an oath to the king, yes, but they swore a higher oath to the Pope in Rome. England, Cromwell argued, was a monster with two heads. Sir, we can imagine him saying in that calm, low voice, why should a foreign bishop in Italy tell the King of England what he can do in his own bedroom? You are the king. You are God's deputy on earth. Why can you not be the Pope in your own kingdom? It was a seduction. Cromwell offered Henry ultimate power. He offered him the wealth of the church. He offered him the son he craved. And all Henry had to do was shatter the unity of Christendom. Henry listened, and for the first time in years the king smiled. Once the decision was made, Cromwell moved with the speed and violence of a modern technocrat. He did not rely on royal decrees which could be ignored. He understood the power of statute. He wanted the break with Rome to be legal, binding, and stamped with the authority of the English people. He turned Parliament into a weapon. Before Cromwell, Parliament was a casual event, summoned only when the king needed taxes, then dismissed. Cromwell made the Reformation Parliament a permanent fixture. He managed the House of Commons like a conductor leading an orchestra. He drafted the bills. He bribed the members. He bullied the dissenters. He sat in the chamber, his hard eyes scanning the rows, noting who shouted aye and who remained silent. In 1533, he drafted the Act in Restraint of Appeals. It is one of the most important documents in British history. The preamble, written in Cromwell's own hand, contains a sentence of thunderous significance, where, by divers sundry, old authentic histories and chronicles, it is manifestly declared and expressed that this realm of England is an empire. Empire. In the 16th century, that word didn't mean colonies and conquest. It meant sovereignty. It meant that England was a closed system. No appeals could go to Rome. No foreign power had jurisdiction here. The buck stopped with Henry. With the stroke of a pen, Cromwell cut the anchor chain that had bound England to Europe for 1,000 years. The way was clear. Thomas Cranmer, the compliant new Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. 5 days later, he declared Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn valid. On June 1st, 1533, a pregnant Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. Cromwell organized the spectacle. He arranged the barges, the pageants, the flowing wine. He ensured it looked like a celebration, even if the crowds on the London streets stood in sullen silence, refusing to take off their caps for the king's whore. Cromwell didn't care about their silence. He cared about the law, and he had won. But a revolution on paper is not enough. You have to enforce it. By 1534, Cromwell was the master secretary. He controlled the flow of information to the king. He controlled the spies. He controlled the courts. He began to construct a surveillance state that would have made his old Italian masters proud. He drafted the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. And to ensure compliance, he drafted the Treason Act. Previously, treason had been limited to actions: plotting the king's death, waging war against him. Cromwell changed the definition. Now, treason could be words. To call the king a heretic, a tyrant, or a schismatic was death. To deny his new title was death. To remain silent, malicious silence, could be construed as death. A darkness fell over England. Men looked over their shoulders in alehouses. Servants were paid to listen to their masters at the dinner table. Cromwell's desk in his narrow office at the Rolls House began to pile high with letters. The vicar of Trumpington said the king is a lecher. The abbot of Glastonbury hid the chalice. The midwife in York prays for Queen Catherine. Cromwell read them all. He filed them in his phenomenal memory, and he began to purge the opposition. The greatest obstacles were not the common people, but the men of principle, the towering figures of the old world who refused to bend the knee to the new reality. The two most dangerous men were John Fisher, the saintly Bishop of Rochester, and Sir Thomas More. The conflict between Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More is the dramatic heart of this era. They were opposites in every way. More was a patrician, a scholar, a man of rigid Catholic principle who wore a hair shirt under his velvet robes to punish his flesh. He believed in the universal authority of the church. He believed that the king's soul was in danger. Cromwell was the pragmatist. He was a man of the world who believed that the primary duty of a subject was to obey his king and ensure the stability of the state. He didn't want martyrs. He wanted citizens. Cromwell actually admired More. He tried repeatedly to save him. There are records of their interrogations in the Tower of London. They read like a chess match between two grandmasters. Cromwell didn't scream or threaten torture. He used logic. Sir Thomas, Cromwell argued, you see that the Parliament has passed the act. You see the bishops have sworn. Why do you set your own private conscience against the wisdom of the whole realm? Do you think you are wiser than the king and the council combined? More's defense was silence. He refused to swear the oath of supremacy, but he refused to say why. He knew that if he spoke, he was dead. So he took refuge in the legal principle that silence implies consent. But Cromwell was tired of legal games. The king was in a rage. The existence of Thomas More, the most respected intellect in Europe, sitting in a prison cell was a public embarrassment to Henry's new regime. It was a silent rebuke. Cromwell knew that for the revolution to survive, the past had to die. He engineered the trial. He allegedly allowed the Solicitor General, Richard Rich, to perjure himself. Rich claimed that More had denied the king's title in a private conversation. It was a lie, but it was enough. On July 6, 1535, Thomas More walked out to Tower Hill. He joked with the lieutenant, asking for help up the rickety stairs of the scaffold. I pray you, Master Lieutenant, see me safe up, and for my coming down, let me shift for myself. The axe fell, and a shudder went through Europe. The King of England had killed a saint. With More and Fisher dead, the opposition was broken. The nobility was cowed. The bishops were terrified. Cromwell was now at the zenith of his power. In 1535, Henry gave him a title that had never existed before and would never exist again: vicegerent in spirituals. It was an absurdity. Cromwell was a layman. He had never been ordained. He was a former mercenary and wool merchant, and yet he was now the vicar general, the king's deputy in all matters of religion. He outranked the Archbishop of Canterbury. When the convocation of bishops met, Thomas Cromwell, the blacksmith's boy, sat at the head of the table. One can only imagine the seething hatred of the old aristocrats, like the Duke of Norfolk. They had to bow to a man whose father had shod their horses. They had to watch as he lectured them on theology. But Cromwell didn't care about their hatred. He had a new target. He looked at the map of England and saw that nearly a third of the land was owned by the monasteries. He saw abbeys that were older than the monarchy, sitting on vast wealth, answering to Rome, and contributing nothing to the king's treasury. He saw the monasteries not as houses of prayer, but as corporate subsidiaries of a foreign power. And he knew that the king, always spending, always building, always warring, needed money. Cromwell sharpened his quill. He called for his commissioners. He was about to launch the greatest act of vandalism and state building in English history. The dissolution was coming. The legislative war was won, but the financial war was just beginning. By 1535, Cromwell had achieved the impossible. He had severed England from Rome. But he knew that a title like Supreme Head of the Church could not buy ships, nor could it satisfy the debts of a king who spent money like water. To secure the revolution, he needed to liquidate the opposition, literally. Henry had squandered the vast fortune left by his father. He had fought pointless wars in France. He had built palaces that sprawled across acres. The royal coffers were empty, echoing with debt. But Cromwell knew where the money was. He looked out across the English landscape, and he saw it dotted with gold mines. They didn't look like mines. They looked like abbeys, priories, and nunneries. There were over 800 religious houses in England. For centuries, the faithful had bequeathed them land, plate, and coin to pray for their souls. They owned perhaps a quarter of the cultivated land in the kingdom. To the devout, these were the fortresses of prayer. To Thomas Cromwell, they were stagnant pools of capital that needed to be liquidated. Cromwell did not simply seize the monasteries. That would have been tyranny. Instead, he did what he always did. He used bureaucracy to legitimize theft. He launched the Valor Ecclesiasticus, the value of the church. It was the Domesday Book of the 16th century. Cromwell sent his commissioners riding out into the shires. These were not holy men. They were accountants and lawyers with sharp nibs and colder hearts. They rode into the ancient courtyards of Fountains, Glastonbury, and Walsingham. They demanded to see the ledgers. They counted every silver chalice, every acre of timber, every sheep, every gemstone on every reliquary. The speed of the operation was terrifying. In less than 6 months, Cromwell had a complete valuation of the church's wealth on his desk. He knew exactly what everything was worth, down to the last penny, but he needed a moral pretext. He couldn't just say, "We want your money." He had to prove that the monasteries were morally bankrupt. So he sent out a second wave of agents, the visitors. The most notorious were Richard Leighton and Thomas Legge. These men were Cromwell's bloodhounds. They were bullies, swaggering into chapter houses, interrogating terrified monks and nuns about their sex lives. They were looking for dirt, and they found it. They sent back breathless, salacious reports to Cromwell. They reported monks with mistresses, nuns with children, abbots skimming funds, fake relics like parings of St. Edmund's toenails or vials of the holy blood that turned out to be duck's blood. Was it all true? Some of it, certainly. Human nature does not stop at the monastery gate, but much of it was exaggerated, tailored to feed the king's indignation. Cromwell took these reports, bound them in a black book, and read them to Parliament. The House of Commons gasped. The king feigned shock. The verdict was delivered. The monasteries were dens of vice. They had to be cleansed. The destruction that followed changed the face of England forever. It was a cultural lobotomy. First the smaller houses went, then the great abbeys. The process was industrial in its efficiency. The commissioners would arrive and evict the monks, giving them a small pension and a change of clothes. Then the demolition crews moved in. The lead was stripped from the roofs and melted down right there in the church naves, the fires fueled by the carved oak choir stalls and ancient library books. The bells were lowered and smashed for scrap metal. The stone was sold to local gentry to build their manor houses. Imagine the scene. The great Abbey of Lewes, which had stood for 400 years, was reduced to rubble in weeks. The tombs of ancestors were broken open, the bones scattered. The magnificent libraries, containing the only copies of Anglo-Saxon history, Greek philosophy, and medieval science, were torn apart. Pages of illuminated manuscripts were used to clean boots, scour candlesticks, or wrap fish. Cromwell was not a barbarian. He was a lover of books. But he was a man who believed the past was dead weight. If destroying a library meant funding the king's navy, he struck the match. The wealth flowed into London. Gold plate, jeweled crucifixes, and velvet vestments were carted to the Tower. The land was sold off to the nobility and the rising gentry. Cromwell was very clever here. By selling the church lands to the gentry, he made them complicit. They would never allow Catholicism to return because if it did, they would lose their new estates. He bought their loyalty with stolen land. But as the monasteries burned, the political temperature in the court was reaching a boiling point. Cromwell had risen in tandem with Anne Boleyn. They were the twin pillars of the Reformation. Anne was the patroness of the new religion, the woman who had captivated the king. Cromwell was the political muscle. They had been allies against the Pope and the old nobility. But by 1536, the alliance was rotting. Anne was not a submissive wife. She was brilliant, volatile, and sharp-tongued. She argued with the king. She was jealous of his mistresses. And crucially, she disagreed with Cromwell on what to do with the money from the monasteries. Anne wanted the funds to go to education and charity. Cromwell needed the funds for the king's wars and to grease the wheels of government. They began to clash. Cromwell, once her servant, now found her dangerous, and Anne had failed in her primary duty. She had miscarried a son in 1534. Then, in January 1536, on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, Anne miscarried again. It was a male fetus. The king's love turned to ash. He began to believe he was cursed. He began to look at Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale, submissive girl, everything Anne was not. Henry wanted out. He summoned Cromwell. He didn't give him a specific order, but the implication was clear. Get rid of her. Cromwell was in a trap. If he failed the king, he would share Wolsey's fate. If he attacked the queen and failed, she would have his head. He realized that for him to survive, Anne Boleyn had to die. What followed was Cromwell's darkest hour. It was a coup d'etat, executed with the precision of a surgeon. He couldn't just divorce Anne. That would leave her free to cause trouble. He needed to destroy her reputation completely. He needed to make her a monster. Cromwell retired to his house, pleading illness, and began to weave the net. He needed a crime so heinous that it would justify execution. Adultery was treason for a queen. But Cromwell went further. He constructed a narrative of insatiable lust, plotting, and incest. He started with the weak link, Mark Smeaton, a commoner, a musician in the Queen's household. Smeaton was arrested and taken to Cromwell's house. We do not know exactly what happened in that room. Smeaton was likely tortured, perhaps with a knotted rope tightened around his eyes or the rack. Whatever happened, Smeaton broke. He confessed to sleeping with the Queen. With this confession in hand, Cromwell widened the net. He targeted the king's inner circle, men who were close to Anne, men who were Cromwell's political rivals. He arrested Henry Norris, the groom of the stool, Sir Francis Weston, and William Brereton. Finally, to seal Anne's fate beyond redemption, he accused her own brother, George Boleyn. It was a preposterous conspiracy. The idea that the Queen had slept with 5 men, including her brother, under the nose of the court, was absurd. The dates didn't match. The evidence was non-existent. But Cromwell didn't need evidence. He needed a verdict. He presided over the investigations with a terrifying calm. He managed the juries. He managed the witnesses. When the men were tried, they were condemned almost instantly. Then came Anne's trial in the Tower of London. Cromwell sat among the judges, his face impassive. He watched as the woman he had helped crown fought for her life. She defended herself with spirit and dignity, tearing the flimsy evidence apart. But the verdict had been written before the trial began. She was found guilty. On May 19th, 1536, Thomas Cromwell stood near the scaffold on Tower Green. He watched as Anne Boleyn, dressed in a robe of gray damask, climbed the stairs. She made a short speech, praising the king's goodness, a final attempt to protect her daughter, Elizabeth. She knelt. The executioner, a specialist swordsman imported from Calais for the occasion, swung the blade. It was over. The Queen was dead. Her brother was dead. Her friends were dead. And Thomas Cromwell was the last man standing. That night, while the king waited impatiently for news so he could ride to Jane Seymour, Cromwell must have felt a cold chill. He had done the king's dirty work. He had removed the obstacle. He had proven his absolute loyalty. But he had also learned a terrible lesson. The king could kill anyone. He could kill a wife he had once moved heaven and earth to marry. He could kill his closest friends. Cromwell knew that he was now alone. He had destroyed the old nobility. He had destroyed the Boleyn faction. He had no allies left, only the king. And the king's favor was as changeable as the English weather. He was now the Lord Privy Seal. He was a baron. He was the most powerful subject in England. But as he looked out over the city of London, he saw the smoke rising from the dissolved abbeys, and he heard the murmurs of a people pushed to the brink. The north was stirring. The common people who loved their monks and their old ways were beginning to whisper. They called Cromwell the Cramp. They called him a heretic, a sorcerer, a low-born villain. The blacksmith's boy had conquered the court. Now he would have to face the wrath of the country. The pilgrimage of grace was coming. The execution of a queen is a trauma that stains the soul of a nation, and as the summer of 1536 broke over England, the atmosphere was brittle with fear. Cromwell had proven he could strike down the highest head in the land, but in doing so, he had stripped away the last veneer of the old chivalric world. He had made the monarchy absolute, but he had also made it terrified. While the court in London tried to move on, bearing the memory of Anne Boleyn along with her headless corpse, the shock waves of her destruction and the destruction of the abbeys were rolling outward, reaching the furthest corners of the realm, where the king's writ ran thin and the people's anger ran deep. The summer of 1536 was hot and pestilent. In London, the smell of charred wood and fresh blood hung in the air. Anne Boleyn was dead. The monasteries were being dismantled. The king, now married to Jane Seymour, was hunting in the forests, trying to forget the woman he had beheaded. But in the north of England, a storm was gathering that would threaten to sweep Thomas Cromwell, and perhaps the Tudor dynasty itself, into the sea. Cromwell, sitting in his office in London, had miscalculated. He had assumed that the English people were like the Londoners, pragmatic, cynical, and ready for change. He had forgotten that in the wild, wind-swept moors of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, the old ways ran deep. For the common people, the monastery wasn't a corporation. It was the center of their universe. It was where they received charity when the harvest failed. It was where they buried their dead. It was where the lights had burned on the altar for 500 years. When Cromwell's commissioners arrived to smash the statues and evict the monks, the people didn't see reform. They saw sacrilege. They saw a blacksmith's son from Putney stealing God's house. It began in October 1536 in the small town of Louth in Lincolnshire. A rumor spread that Cromwell was coming to seize the church plate. A mob formed. They seized the king's commissioners. They burned their papers. Within days, the spark became a wildfire. The uprising spread into Yorkshire and became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. It was not a riot. It was an army. Led by a one-eyed lawyer named Robert Aske, 30,000 men marched under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. They were well-armed, well-organized, and utterly fearless. They outnumbered the king's forces 4-1. If they had chosen to march on London, they likely could have taken the capital. And they had one clear demand. They swore loyalty to King Henry, but they demanded the head of the evil counselor. They demanded Thomas Cromwell. They wrote ballads about him, calling him a shearman, a lowly clothworker, and a heretic. They blamed him for the new taxes, the new laws, the destruction of the abbeys. He was the lightning rod for the nation's rage. In London, panic set in. The king was furious, railing against his brute and beastly subjects. But he was also terrified. He had no standing army. He sent the Duke of Norfolk north to negotiate simply because he had no other choice. For Cromwell, this was the nightmare scenario. He was trapped in London, knowing that an army was marching south with the specific intention of tearing him limb from limb. The nobles at court, led by Norfolk, were gleeful. They whispered that the king should give the rebels what they wanted. Throw Cromwell to the wolves, they said, and the rebels will go home. Cromwell stayed in his chambers. He worked. He fortified the tower. He managed the supply lines. And he trusted in one thing, Henry's arrogance. He knew Henry would never bow to a mob. To give up Cromwell would be to admit the king was wrong. And Henry VIII was never wrong. The rebellion was defeated not by swords, but by lies. The Duke of Norfolk, acting on Henry's orders, met the rebels at Doncaster Bridge. He promised them everything. He promised a pardon. He promised a parliament in York to discuss their grievances. He promised that the dissolution of the abbeys would stop. Robert Aske, a naive man who believed in the honor of kings, accepted the deal. He ordered his men to disband. The great army of the North melted away, returning to their farms, believing they had won. Then the trap snapped shut. In 1537, on the pretext of a minor new skirmish, Henry declared the truce void. He unleashed martial law on the North. It was a slaughter. Cromwell, managing the legalities from London, ensured the leaders were rounded up. Robert Aske was dragged in chains to York and hanged from the castle keep. The abbots who had supported the rebellion were executed. Hundreds of commoners were strung up on trees in their own villages as a warning. Cromwell survived. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked. But the lesson was clear. The country hated him. The nobles hated him. Only the king's protection kept him alive. And then the sun broke through the clouds. On October 12th, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, Queen Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy boy, Edward. The relief was seismic. Bonfires were lit across England. Wine flowed in the conduits. Henry finally had his male heir. The Tudor dynasty was secure. Cromwell was ecstatic. He had engineered the marriage to Jane. He organized the christening, a spectacle of immense grandeur. In the procession, Cromwell walked with the highest lords of the land. He was made a Knight of the Garter. He was at the peak of his influence. But tragedy, as always, was the shadow at the feast. 12 days after the birth, Queen Jane died of puerperal fever. Henry was devastated. He locked himself away wearing black, mourning the only wife who had given him a son and hadn't lived long enough to annoy him. For Cromwell, Jane's death was a personal loss, but also a political opportunity. A king without a wife is a diplomatic asset. Cromwell immediately began scanning the map of Europe. He needed to find a new bride for Henry, one who would bring a powerful alliance. With the rebellion crushed and the heir secure, Cromwell unleashed the second phase of his revolution. This time, it wasn't just about money, it was about theology. Cromwell was a closet evangelical. He read Tyndale. He believed in the vernacular Bible. Now he felt strong enough to push his true agenda. In 1538, he issued a new set of injunctions. They were radical. He ordered that every parish church in England must purchase a copy of the Bible in English. Pause to consider the magnitude of this. For 1,000 years, the Word of God had been locked in Latin, the property of the priests. Now, the plowboy could hear the Gospels in his own tongue. It was a democratization of knowledge that would change the English mind forever. But Cromwell went further. He declared war on idolatry. He targeted the shrines. For centuries, pilgrims had flocked to statues of saints, offering coins and candles for miracles. Cromwell saw this as superstition and a fraud. He sent his men to dismantle the most famous shrines in the land. The Rood of Grace at Boxley Abbey, a statue of Jesus that moved its eyes and lips, was taken to London. Cromwell's men showed the crowd the wires and pulleys behind the head. The crowd laughed and jeered. The statue was tossed into a bonfire. Then he went for the biggest prize of all, St. Thomas Becket. Becket was the most popular saint in England, the martyr who had defied a king. His shrine at Canterbury was a mountain of gold and jewels. Cromwell not only destroyed the shrine, carting away 26 wagon loads of treasure, he legally desainted Becket. He put the dead saint on trial, found him guilty of treason, and ordered his bones burned. It was a breathtaking display of power. Cromwell was rewriting the past. He was telling the people that their ancestors had been duped. But while Cromwell was smashing idols, the international situation was darkening. In 1538, the two great Catholic superpowers of Europe, France and the Holy Roman Empire, signed a peace treaty. The Pope issued a bull of excommunication against Henry, calling for a crusade to depose the heretic king. England faced the terrifying prospect of a united Catholic invasion. Cromwell knew that England could not stand alone. He needed chins. He looked to Germany, to the League of Protestant princes who were resisting the emperor. An alliance with them would secure England's flank. And the key to that alliance was a marriage. Cromwell's agents reported that the Duke of Cleves, a strategically important German leader, had two sisters. The elder was already married, but the younger, Anne, was available. Cromwell had never seen her. He sent the artist Hans Holbein the Younger to Turin to paint her portrait. Holbein returned with a miniature. It showed a woman with a pleasant, if somewhat placid face. She looked dignified. She looked suitable. Cromwell showed the portrait to Henry. The king, lonely and anxious about the invasion threat, agreed. The contract was signed. Anne of Cleves was coming to England. This was Cromwell's gamble. He was betting everything on this marriage. It was the capstone of his foreign policy. If it succeeded, England would be the leader of a Protestant Europe. But Cromwell, the master of data, had missed the human element. He had forgotten that Henry was not just a king. He was a romantic, aging man who fancied himself a connoisseur of women. Anne arrived in England in late December 1539. She was tired, she spoke no English, and her fashion was heavy and unfashionable compared to the French styles Henry preferred. Henry, in a fit of boyish romance, decided to surprise her. He rode to Rochester in disguise, bursting into her room wearing a cloak, expecting her to recognize his majesty by instinct. Anne, seeing a fat old stranger grabbing her, was understandably terrified. She turned away from him. The king's ego was shattered. He stormed out. He later told Cromwell, "I like her not. She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported to be." History would later cruelly nickname her the Flanders mare, though Henry simply found her repulsive. Cromwell felt the ground open up beneath him. He tried to smooth it over. He urged the king to go through with the wedding for the sake of the alliance. "She has a queenly manner," he pleaded. Henry married her on January 6, 1540. But the next morning the king was in a foul mood. He told his courtiers that he had been unable to consummate the marriage. He blamed Anne's appearance, her smell, her looseness of flesh. The king was humiliated. And when Henry felt humiliated, he looked for someone to blame. The sharks in the council, the Duke of Norfolk and his ally, the wily Bishop Stephen Gardiner, smelled blood in the water. They had been waiting for 10 years for Cromwell to slip. Now he had not just slipped, he had fallen into a pit. They began to whisper in the king's ear. They told him that Cromwell wasn't just incompetent, he was a traitor. They said he was forcing the king into a Lutheran religion he hated. They said Cromwell was building his own power base to overrule the king. Cromwell was still working, still passing laws, still running the country. In April 1540, he was even made Earl of Essex. But it was a phantom honor. The king's eyes had gone cold. The invitation to the final lunch was sent. The trap was now primed, the bait taken, and the mechanism released. For 10 years, Thomas Cromwell had outrun his own shadow, staying one step ahead of the ancient families who despised him and the foreign powers who wanted him burned. He had survived the fall of Wolsey, the execution of More, the death of Boleyn, and the rage of the North. But the fiasco of the Cleves marriage was the one error the king's vanity could not forgive. As the summer of 1540 approached, the man who had been the hunter for a decade suddenly found himself the quarry. The invitation to the council meeting was not a summons to work. It was a summons to the end of an era. The end, when it came, was a scene of such theatrical violence that it feels like something Shakespeare might have rejected as too melodramatic. But it happened. The date was Saturday, June 10th, 1540. It was a humid summer day in Westminster. The Privy Council was scheduled to meet at 3 p.m. Thomas Cromwell arrived late. This was unlike him. He was a man of precision. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he was delaying the inevitable. When he walked into the council chamber, the atmosphere was frozen. The men seated around the table, the Duke of Norfolk, the Duke of Suffolk, Bishop Gardiner, were his colleagues. He had worked with them, dined with them, and outmaneuvered them for a decade. Now they looked at him not as a superior but as prey. Cromwell approached the window, looking out toward the Thames. "Gentlemen," he said, turning back to the table, "you are early." "We are not early," the Duke of Norfolk snarled. "You are late." Before Cromwell could take his seat, the captain of the guard stepped forward. "Thomas Cromwell," the Duke of Norfolk announced, his voice trembling with the release of 10 years of suppressed rage. "I arrest you of high treason." Cromwell stood frozen. He looked at the faces around the table. There was no sympathy, only triumph. In a flash of the temper he had inherited from his blacksmith father, Cromwell snatched the cap from his head and threw it violently to the floor. "This, then, is my reward for faithful service," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I have not offended my prince, but if this is how I am to be treated, I renounce all mercy. I call upon you to name me a traitor to my face." Norfolk, stepping close enough to smell the sweat on his enemy, ripped the chain of the Order of the Garter from Cromwell's neck. "Traitor," he spat. "You are a traitor to the king and a heretic to God." They tore the George from his neck. They bound his hands. The man who had held the fate of England in his palm was dragged out of the palace, down the stone steps, and onto a waiting barge. He was rowed down the river to the Traitor's Gate. The heavy portcullis of the Tower of London groaned open, and Thomas Cromwell was swallowed by the darkness he had sent so many others into. In the Tower, Cromwell was not given a trial. This was the supreme irony of his life. In his years of power, Cromwell had perfected the use of the Act of Attainder, a legislative device that allowed Parliament to declare a person guilty of treason without the need for a trial, evidence, or defense. He had used it to crush the Countess of Salisbury and others. Now his enemies used his own weapon against him. The charges were a mix of hysteria and fabrication. They accused him of being a sacramentarian, a radical heretic who denied the real presence in the Eucharist. They claimed he had said he would fight against the king if the king turned away from Protestantism. They accused him of accepting bribes, which everyone did, but Cromwell did on an industrial scale. It didn't matter if the charges were true. The king wanted him gone, but Henry, in his twisted way, still needed him. Even as Cromwell sat in his cell fearing the axe, the king sent him questions. Henry needed Cromwell to provide the legal evidence to annul the marriage to Anne of Cleves. Cromwell, desperate for life, obliged. He wrote a long, detailed statement supporting the king's claim of non-consummation. He humiliated himself, revealing intimate conversations, doing whatever was necessary to serve the master who was killing him. He also wrote a final letter to Henry. It is one of the most heartbreaking documents in the British archives. The cool Machiavellian mask slips away and we see a terrified man pleading for his existence. He recounts his years of service. He denies the treason. He begs the king not to believe the lies of his enemies. And he ends the letter with a scrawl that trails off the bottom of the page. A cry from the soul. Most gracious prince, I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy. Henry was moved. He reportedly had the letter read to him 3 times. But he did not grant mercy. The political pressure was too great. His embarrassment over Anne of Cleves too fresh. The machine Cromwell had built was too efficient to be stopped. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led out to Tower Hill. It was a significant day. Across town, at Oatlands Palace, Henry VIII was marrying his 5th wife, the teenage Catherine Howard, the niece of Cromwell's mortal enemy, the Duke of Norfolk. The old nobility was back in charge. The golden age of the Howards had begun, and the era of the blacksmith was ending in blood. Cromwell stood on the scaffold. He was calm now. He gave the traditional speech of the condemned. He did not scream defiance. He did not claim innocence. He knew that to die badly would endanger his son Gregory. For the sake of his family's survival, he played the part. I am come hither to die, he told the crowd. He confessed to having been a sinner. He prayed for the king. He knelt at the block. History tells us it was a butchery. The executioner was possibly drunk or inexperienced, or perhaps paid by Cromwell's enemies to make it painful. The first blow did not sever the neck. It hacked into the shoulders or the skull. The crowd gasped. It took 2, perhaps 3 clumsy strikes to finish the job. The head of the most capable administrator England had ever seen was boiled, dipped in tar to preserve it, and spiked on London Bridge. It stared out over the city he had modernized, its eyes fixed on the horizon. But the story has a final twist. Usually when Henry VIII killed a minister, he never looked back. But Cromwell was different. Within months, the new regime was falling apart. Catherine Howard was proving to be a flighty, dangerous distraction. The Privy Council, without Cromwell's discipline, dissolved into squabbling factions. The king's papers were disorganized. The treasury was chaotic. Henry began to rage at his courtiers. He shouted that they were liars. He accused them of tricking him. According to the French ambassador, Henry was heard lamenting that, under the pretext of some trivial offenses, his counselors had made him put to death the most faithful servant he ever had. Henry missed his fixer. He realized too late that while Norfolk and Gardiner could flatter him, they could not run a country. He had broken the only tool that worked. So, what is the legacy of the blacksmith's boy? For centuries, Victorian historians painted Thomas Cromwell as the villain of the Tudor age, a cold, bureaucratic, ISIS-style destroyer of beauty, the man who smashed the stained glass and silenced the choirs. But if you look around the world today, you are living in the house Thomas Cromwell built. He created the modern state. Before Cromwell, government was the king's household. After Cromwell, it was a bureaucracy. He created the departments of state that still exist in some form. He professionalized the civil service. He gave us the parish register. Every time you look up your family tree, finding a birth, marriage, or death record from 1538 onwards, you are thanking Thomas Cromwell. He knew that to govern a people, you must count them. He gave England the Bible. By placing the scriptures in English in every church, he inadvertently taught the English people to read, to question, and to think for themselves. He planted the seeds of the Puritanism that would one day overthrow the monarchy itself. He was a man of contradictions. He was a brute who loved poetry. He was a reformer who used torture. He was a visionary who destroyed the past to build the future. Thomas Cromwell rose from the mud of Putney to the highest seat in the land, proving that in England, ability could matter more than birth. He was the first modern man, a meritocrat in a world of aristocrats. He walked into the dark so the state could see the light, and perhaps in the silence of the National Archives, where his handwriting still sits on thousands of documents, the blacksmith's boy is still working, still fixing, still serving a king who never deserved him.